Who could have imagined that one of the greatest financial empires in United States history, built on tiny copper coins, would collapse under the weight of diamonds, aristocratic titles, and absolute human loneliness? What happened to the fortune that, at the height of the Great Depression, made one young woman richer than entire nations? And why has history largely remained silent about how capital, built over decades of hard labor, dissolved in the hands of 7 men, leaving behind only an echo in the empty halls of the world's greatest palaces? This story begins not in a palace, but behind the counter of a tiny provincial store, where a concept was born that forever changed global trade. But its main heroine became the one who reaped the fruits of this commercial revolution. Barbara Hutton was born in 1912. At first glance, she was destined for an absolutely fairy tale life. Her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, from a modest farming family with one striking character trait, a phenomenal obsession with control and efficiency, built a gigantic retail network. He sold consumer goods for 5 and 10 cents, amassing his astronomical fortune literally penny by penny from the pockets of the working class. No one knew that these modest coins from millions of ordinary Americans would one day turn into rubies of the Romanov dynasty and Venetian palazzos for his only granddaughter. It seemed impossible that the life of the heiress to such a colossal fortune would turn into a continuous public tragedy. In the United States press, Barbara Hutton was dubbed the poor little rich girl. Behind this newspaper cliché lurked a frightening contrast between unprecedented external splendor and profound inner horror. In 1917, when the girl was just 5 years old, her carefree childhood ended forever. In the silence of the luxurious family mansion, little Barbara opened a door and found her mother, Edna Woolworth, lifeless. Official documents of the time recorded a sudden death, but this sudden and inexplicable loss for a child forever burned a gaping void in her soul. This unhealing trauma became the invisible axis around which her entire life would later revolve. When, on her 21st birthday in 1933, Barbara inherited about $50 million, the world was on the brink of total economic collapse. Adjusted for modern realities, this amount would significantly exceed $1 billion. Millions of unemployed people stood in endless lines for free soup, while the young heiress snapped up masterpieces of world art and built grand estates. She became a symbol for society of absolute, almost offensive wealth. But behind the facade of this dazzling splendor, an irreversible mechanism of self-destruction was already set in motion. Her grandfather's inheritance, amassed through grueling labor and cold commercial calculation, fell into the hands of a broken person who desperately tried to buy what cannot be bought for any money. Barbara sought love, a sense of basic security, and the right to simple human warmth. She was destined to marry 7 times, giving away her heart, and along with it tens of millions of dollars, to cynical European aristocrats, a Hollywood star, ambitious diplomats, and race car drivers. This is not just a story of recklessly squandered wealth. This is a large-scale historical study of how astronomical money becomes the world's most luxurious prison. How did it happen that a woman who owned the second-largest private park in London and the planet's most expensive historical jewels ended up locked in a hotel room at the end of her life with just $3,000 in her account? To understand the anatomy of this tragedy, we need to go back to the origins, to the worldview of the empire's creator, who taught all of America to shop, but could never lay the foundation for his own family's happiness. To understand the nature of such a massive financial collapse, We must descend to the roots of the tree whose fruits turned out to be truly poisonous. The Woolworth Empire did not arise by the wave of a magic wand. It was forged in the crucible of the harshest social ambition and the unique psychological insight of a man named Frank Winfield Woolworth. He was born in 1852 on a poor potato farm in northern New York State. Frank was an absolute outsider, a timid young man without connections, without family capital, and without elite education, but with one paradoxical ability. He knew how to read the hidden fears of ordinary people. In those days, traditional trade was built on social pressure and humiliation. Open price tags simply did not exist. The customer had to enter the shop and ask the haughty salesman for the price, who would assess the client's appearance and name a sum at his own discretion, often making the poor blush with shame, haggle, or leave empty-handed. Frank saw in this psychological discomfort the greatest business strategy of the coming century. He understood what owners of luxury boutiques stubbornly overlooked. If you relieve a poor person of the fear of being rejected or humiliated, he will gladly hand over his last pennies to you. Thus was born the revolutionary idea of fixed-price stores, where every item cost exactly 5 or 10 cents. No haggling, no appraising looks, just open display cases and free choice. After the first crushing failure in the city of Utica, Frank did not give up, but rethought his approach. In 1879, in the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he opened his first truly successful store. His strategy for overcoming obstacles was based not on blind luck, but on ruthless calculation. He personally traveled to factories, completely cut out greedy middlemen from the supply chain, drove purchase prices down to minimum levels, and bought in colossal volumes. Frank was a complex, deeply ambiguous figure. On one hand, he was a genius dreamer who democratized trade for ordinary people. On the other hand, he remained a cold calculator, paying his sales girls paltry wages in order to preserve that very 10-cent price on the shelf at any cost. This unprecedented financial ascent gave rise to a deep social conflict. At the turn of the century in the United States, old money ruled. The Astor and Vanderbilt families, whose colossal wealth was passed down from generation to generation, looked upon Frank with open contempt. To the closed elite, he forever remained an upstart, a seller of cheap soap dishes and trinkets, the king of copper pennies. The doors of Manhattan's exclusive aristocratic clubs remained haughtily closed to him. But Frank Woolworth decided to break this system, not through attempts at assimilation, but through monumental architectural dominance. In 1913, he erected the greatest monument to his own wounded pride, the neo-Gothic Woolworth Building skyscraper in New York. At that time, it was the tallest building on the planet, and Frank did what made the old aristocracy shudder. He fully paid for the grandiose construction in cash, shelling out $15 million. No bank loans or debt obligations, just an endless stream of 5-cent coins transformed into Gothic architecture gleaming in the sun. He proudly called his creation the Cathedral of Commerce. Frank sincerely believed that these colossal stone vaults would ensure his lineage absolute invulnerability and eternal greatness. His worldview was utterly materialistic. The empire's creator was convinced that any life problem, any social status, and any human loyalty could simply be bought if offered the right price. And it was precisely this dangerous, distorted illusion that became the fatal curse for his family. The grandfather taught his descendants to masterfully measure the world's value in numbers, but left them utterly blind and defenseless against things that cannot have a price tag. No one suspected then that this cold philosophy of money's omnipotence would, just 2 decades later, force his young granddaughter Barbara to make the most destructive mistake of her life. She would sincerely believe that true love and loyalty could be just as easily acquired for cash, and soon she would meet those who would gladly present her with this deadly bill. When, in 1933, Barbara Hutton reached the 21st year of her life, she officially gained full legal and financial control over her astronomical inheritance. It was precisely at this pivotal historical moment that a figure appeared on the stage of her life who radically changed all the rules of the game and set in motion a grandiose mechanism of merging vast capitals and ancient titles. This man was the Georgian prince Alexis Mdivani. He belonged to that category of brilliant European émigrés who, after bloody revolutionary upheavals, found themselves in Paris with impeccable social manners, extraordinarily loud pedigrees, but absolutely empty bank accounts. This was not an ordinary romantic infatuation of a young and naive girl. This was a monumental historical clash of two worlds that desperately and painfully needed each other. On one side stood confidently the powerful American new money, earned on the copper pennies of millions of ordinary workers and holding no social weight whatsoever in Europe's closed, arrogant high society. On the other side proudly stood the ancient, impoverished aristocracy, ready, without hesitation, to exchange their centuries-old noble titles for a bank check with 6 zeros. Barbara's marriage to Alexis, lavishly solemnized in Paris, became that very strategic turning point that instantly transformed the position of the main heroine in the world hierarchy. In one single day, from the ordinary granddaughter of a cheap goods merchant, she turned into a genuine European princess. For this grand social leap, the American heiress paid generously, fully settling her husband's family's colossal debts and ensuring him a luxurious, carefree existence. However, this calculated alliance proved incredibly fragile. The prince recklessly squandered millions on sports cars for polo, rare racehorses, and endless social receptions, failing to give Barbara the one thing she so desperately sought: sincere human attachment and emotional security. Their union fell apart after just a couple of years, ending with multi-million-dollar settlements for Alexis and his subsequent tragic death in a high-speed car crash. But Barbara had already firmly learned the main law of high society. Acquired status requires a corresponding monumental decoration. After marrying for the second time to Danish Count Kurt Haugwitz Reventlow, she decided to physically materialize her new aristocratic position. In 1936, in rainy London, she began creating a grandiose object that was to become the indisputable embodiment of her boundless power, her inaccessibility, and her personal security. This incredible project became the residence Winfield House, named in honor of her famous ancestor. Barbara acquired a colossal plot of land in the very heart of prestigious Regent's Park and ordered the immediate demolition of the classic mansion standing there, to build from scratch something utterly unimaginable in its scale. This house was originally conceived not simply as a comfortable place for a young aristocratic family to live. It was created as an impregnable personal fortress, and simultaneously as a dazzling showcase of the absolute triumph of new American money over the conservative old world. Winfield House became a symbol of a striking historical contrast, where age-old English tradition came face to face with uncompromising American progress. From the outside, it was a majestic neo-Gothic palace of noble red brick, looking as if it had stood motionless on this British soil for many long centuries. However, inside, it represented a true wonder of innovative 20th century engineering technologies. This was an unprecedented fusion of eras, where the rarest antique furniture from abandoned French chateaux harmoniously coexisted with the latest hidden central heating systems and the most complex electrical wiring, which the overwhelming majority of London aristocrats of that time could only dream of in their cold ancestral estates. The scale of this ambitious architectural masterpiece openly challenged the British monarch himself. The estate sprawled freely over 12 acres of impeccably manicured land, forming the second largest private garden in the capital, surpassed in its incredible size only by the sovereign territory of Buckingham Palace. Barbara personally designed and built for herself 35 luxurious rooms, each of which became a separate, complete work of high art. In this grandiose, enclosed space, she obsessively tried to create an unbreakable illusion of an ideal, fully protected world, of which she had been so cruelly and suddenly deprived in her early childhood after losing her birth mother. Here, behind the high and heavy wrought iron gates, she sincerely hoped to find the long-awaited peace of mind, densely surrounding herself with flawless, million-dollar beauty. The creation of Winfield House became the highest culmination of her long-term strategy to conquer old Europe. Barbara coolly bought entire historical rooms from ruined continental palaces, carefully dismantling them and shipping them across the oceans to permanently integrate into her London monument. She commissioned original, authentic canvases by the great Canaletto, and without the slightest hesitation, acquired priceless handmade Persian rugs. Antique Venetian mirrors and massive gilded frames made natural light dance fancifully on the polished marble floors of the grand halls, while in the gigantic open fireplaces, a roaring fire was lit every evening, capable of consuming an entire tree in mere hours. This was a vast space, thoroughly imbued with the noble scent of aged wood, expensive exclusive perfumes, and absolute financial power. Exquisite antique furniture from continental Europe, which literally smelled of past centuries, was meant to finally legitimize the American fortune. However, behind every velvet armchair and sparkling crystal chandelier lurked a silent and frightening question. Could this aesthetic harmony hide the growing, horrifying dissonance in relations with her husband, whose overt cruelty would soon turn this magnificent palace into the most luxurious golden cage on earth? Crossing the massive threshold of the London mansion Winfield House at the end of the 1930s, every guest instantly experienced a stunning physical contrast. Behind the heavy oak doors remained the noisy, dirty, coal smog-infused pre-war London, full of anxieties. Inside, however, opened a completely different, sterile, and eerily perfect world, where time flowed according to laws written by the possessor of boundless wealth. The first impression of the Grand Hall was meant not just to amaze, but to crush the will of the entrant. Vast spaces, flooded with unnaturally even light, served not for comfort, but acted as a gigantic psychological shell for Barbara Hutton. This architecture was her way of telling the ancient European aristocracy that she was not just equal to them. She could buy their history wholesale and rebuild it anew on her own 12 acres of land. The progressive unfolding of this palace resembled immersion in a complex labyrinth of human complexes. From the grand vestibule, overwhelming in its splendor and created for the demonstration of absolute triumph, guests proceeded to a suite of formal drawing rooms. Here, decorativeness reached its historical apex. The walls of these halls were completely covered with genuine 18th-century French wooden panels, which had been carefully dismantled in ruined chateaux near Paris and delivered to the capital of Great Britain. These walls, which whispered stories of French kings, now belonged to the granddaughter of an American shopkeeper. Tall Venetian mirrors, brought from Italian palazzos, made light dance on the polished surfaces of the rarest marble, creating an illusion of infinite, unrestricted space. In the gigantic central fireplace, where an entire tree burned, They constantly maintained the fire, but even this roaring heat could not dispel the piercing psychological cold from the vast halls. Each room in this 35-room house symbolized a specific need of its mistress.
Libraries and art galleries, adorned with originals by Canaletto, served as certificates of her cultural legitimacy. Exquisite antique furniture from continental Europe, which smelled of centuries and bore traces of touches from long-dead dukes, was meant to compensate for Barbara's lack of her own long pedigree. In the dining room, where dozens of representatives of high British society, including the Prince of Wales himself, could dine simultaneously, dishes were served on gold plate. An invisible army of more than 60 servants moved through hidden corridors absolutely silently, like ghosts. They changed live orchids in all rooms twice a day, maintaining the illusion of eternal spring. But it was precisely here, in the very heart of this splendor, that the main, soul-chilling paradox of Winfield House hid, which forever overturns the understanding of this architectural fairy tale. The transition from the public halls to Barbara's private quarters revealed a terrifying psychological transformation. If the first floor was a monument to power, then the mistress's bedroom on the second floor became her only fragile refuge. This entire colossal project, whose construction required millions of dollars and countless man-hours, was created as an impregnable fortress meant to protect the little rich girl from the cruel outside world. But the thick brick walls, wrought iron gates, and dozens of guards did not save her, because the main threat was not outside. The horror was that the perfect fortress locked its mistress alone with her worst nightmare. Power in this house, despite all the financial documents, invisibly passed into the hands of her second husband, Count Kurt Haugwitz Reventlow. The man to whom Barbara entrusted her life turned out to be a pathologically cruel tyrant. Luxurious French panels every evening absorbed the sounds of scandals and desperate cries, while antique mirrors reflected traces of brutal beatings on the face of the world's richest woman. The servants, drilled to automatism, averted their eyes and pretended to be deaf, adhering to a strict protocol of non-interference in the affairs of an aristocratic family. Historical chronicles have preserved the facts that the Count subjected her to monstrous physical violence, driving her to nervous exhaustion and dependence on sedatives. The house, which was supposed to become a monument to her independence, turned into the most expensive and beautiful prison cell in European history. Barbara could buy Canaletto paintings, but she could not buy her own safety. She could hire 60 servants, but none of them came to her aid when her life was falling apart behind the closed doors of the bedroom. This incredible palace became a living architectural testament that colossal ambitions can erect impenetrable walls, but they are utterly powerless against the fragility of the human soul. Behind the facade of the monumental Winfield House, as Europe rapidly slid into the abyss of the approaching Second World War, a deeply intimate human tragedy unfolded, which forces us to radically reconsider the entire moral coordinate system of this story. Barbara Hutton was at the epicenter of a destructive psychological conflict. This was not just the trivial sadness of a bored rich woman. This was an irresolvable contradiction between the colossal, oppressive external grandeur of her financial empire and the absolutely scorched, gaping inner void that she desperately tried to fill. She was trapped in a vicious circle. Her ambitions demanded constant status confirmation through the purchase of palaces and aristocratic husbands, but her psyche, wounded from the earliest childhood, begged only for unconditional love that could not be bought for any money. The birth in 1936 of her only son, Lance Reventlow, became that very catalyst that finally exposed the entire moral ambivalence of her existence. The child, born into an atmosphere of incessant domestic violence and emotional terror from Count Kurt, was supposed to become Barbara's anchor of salvation.
However, the trauma inflicted by the sudden death of her own mother made her pathologically unable to build a normal emotional bond with the infant. She loved Lance, but this love manifested through the prism of the only language available to her, the language of unlimited finances. She hired a whole army of governesses, bodyguards, and doctors, building around her son the same golden wall of alienation behind which she herself hid. In 1938, the family situation reached a critical point, which led to an unprecedented scandal for high society. Count Reventlow, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, subjected Barbara to the most brutal physical violence, as a result of which she ended up in the hospital, and the aristocrat was publicly arrested and sent to prison. This turning point forces us to pose the most complex question. Who was Barbara Hutton really? Was she a cynical and spoiled anti-heroine, buying titles and encouraging the parasitic lifestyle of the European elite? Or was she a tragic victim of colossal capital, unable to resist the predators whom she herself attracted with the clink of her golden coins? The society of that time knew no pity. While millions of people were losing jobs and starving, the press savored every detail of her humiliating divorce with open glee, portraying her as a capricious and ungrateful heiress who did not know how to appreciate her own happiness. This deepest crisis forced Barbara to try to break the fatal script. She took little Lance and fled from England back to the United States, hoping that returning to her homeland would restore her emotional balance. It was there, in 1942, that a figure appeared in her life who completely overturned all established stereotypes about the men surrounding the Woolworth empire heiress. This man was Cary Grant, the brilliant Hollywood star and cinema icon. At first glance, it seemed like just another superficial union of two celebrities, but historical facts tell a completely different story. Cary Grant became the second key character in this act, whose intervention could have changed everything. Unlike the titled European aristocrats with their multi-million-dollar debts, Grant was incredibly successful, financially completely independent, and did not need her money. He sincerely tried to pull Barbara out of the abyss of dependence on sedatives and severe anorexia into which she was steadily sinking. He tried to replace the army of governesses by spending time with little Lance and attempting to create a semblance of a normal family for him. Grant was the only person who saw in her not a bottomless bank account, but a broken, deeply unhappy woman in need of protection from herself. But the tragedy was that saving a person whose worldview was completely deformed by money proved impossible. Barbara was so traumatized by the betrayal of her previous husbands and the falsity of her surroundings that she had unlearned how to believe in sincerity. She herself methodically destroyed this marriage with her pathological jealousy and progressing depression. When in 1945 their paths finally diverged, something happened that forever shattered the pattern of behavior of Barbara's husbands. In the divorce, Cary Grant categorically refused any financial claims, not taking a single cent from her. This act paradoxically brought her no relief. On the contrary, it only underscored that horrifying fact that the only relationship built not on buying status had failed solely because of her own inner demons. She did not transform. She remained one-on-one with her pain, preparing for a new, even more massive fall into the abyss of despair. Society could condemn her methods and recklessness, but no one could deny the scale of that human tragedy unfolding against the backdrop of the world's most expensive decorations. The viewer remains in deep doubt. Can one judge a person whose soul was crushed by the weight of gold bars even before she could make her first conscious choice? By the mid-20th century, the world around Barbara Hutton began to change rapidly and irreversibly, and the massive external crisis engulfing the planet became a powerful catalyst for her internal reevaluation. World War II ruthlessly swept old Europe off the face of the earth. That very Europe which Barbara had tried to methodically buy up piece by piece. Palaces were destroyed. Ancient aristocratic titles were devalued in the face of global catastrophe. And her monumental Winfield House in London, which she had built as an impregnable personal fortress, proved absolutely defenseless against German bombings. The war brutally demonstrated to her the illusory nature of material power and the impossibility of fencing oneself off from the course of history with high wrought iron fences. This realization became the inevitable consequence of her previous disappointments. If money could not buy her love in marriages with Medivani and Reventlow, and if it could not hold on to the sincere Cary Grant, then it proved powerless even against the bombs falling on the roof of her perfect home. This deepest crisis forced Barbara to commit an unprecedented act that radically changed the vector of her attitude toward her own wealth. In 1946, she makes a historic decision. She transfers her magnificent London palace Winfield House, with its 35 rooms, priceless French panels, and 12 acres of land in the center of Regent's Park, to the government of the United States. The price of this deal amounted to exactly $1 symbolic dollar. This was the turning point of transformation of the original goal. If previously she maniacally bought up real estate and works of art solely for asserting her personal power and creating a protective barrier from the world, now she sought meaning and legacy. The desperate need for possession gave way to a timid attempt at service. The house, which had been a witness to her most terrible humiliations and pain in her marriage to the cruel Count, was reborn as the official residence of the American ambassador to Great Britain, becoming a tool of international diplomacy and public good. However, this flash of enlightenment did not become her final salvation. Barbara's inner demons, fueled by severe anorexia and the deepest dependence on medications, demanded ever more new victims. She continued her run in circles, entering into new, increasingly absurd and destructive marriages. In 1947, she marries Russian prince and race car driver Igor Trubetskoy. In 1953, follows a scandalous and incredibly short, lasting only 53 days, marriage to Dominican diplomat and playboy Porfirio Rubirosa, which cost her $2.5 million in settlement. Then came the union with German tennis baron Gottfried von Kamm in 1955. Each new husband was merely a desperate attempt to buy anesthesia from the corroding loneliness. But the most terrible, irreparable blow, which finally broke her spirit and destroyed all remnants of her empire, was not dealt by greedy husbands or economic crises. It came from where she feared it the most. In 1972, her only son, Lance Reventlow, for whom she had once tried to change her life and whose childhood she had so clumsily tried to protect with an army of bodyguards, tragically perished in a plane crash in the mountains of Colorado. Lance was an experienced pilot, racer, a man who seemed to have broken free from the suffocating oversight of his mother's millions and found his own path. His death became, for Barbara, an absolute, insurmountable point of no return. At this moment, the figure of Cary Grant, the only husband who had once tried to save her, appears in the story in a new, incredibly tragic light.
It was precisely Grant, and not anyone from her numerous paid entourage or titled ex-relatives, who took on the heaviest duty of informing Barbara about her son's death and organizing his funeral. His actions, decades after their divorce, found a new, piercing explanation. He remained the only person who preserved true, selfless human compassion for her. Losing Lance, Barbara lost her last connection to reality. The great transformation was never completed. Having given away her main London palace for the benefit of the state, she could not sacrifice her pain.
The remaining years turned into voluntary seclusion and a slow, agonizing fading in the darkness of a hotel room, where all her billions finally lost all meaning. The final act of this grand drama unfolds not in the dazzling interiors of Venetian palazzos or on the manicured lawns of Winfield House, but in the faceless, though expensive, apartments of a hotel in Beverly Hills.
The last years of Barbara Hutton's life became a living metaphor for how colossal wealth can consume its creator. The woman whose name for decades did not leave the front pages of world newspapers, she who once amazed the public with the purchase of the Romanov dynasty's emeralds and Marie Antoinette's pearls, voluntarily locked herself within four walls. She was bedridden, practically blind from progressing cataracts, and in a state of deepest drug-induced stupor. Her once mighty entourage, numbering hundreds of servants, lawyers, and advisors, dissolved, leaving only those who methodically plundered the remnants of her collapsed empire. When in the spring of 1979 Barbara Hutton passed away, the examination of her financial accounts shocked the entire financial world of the United States. Of that unimaginable wealth, which on the day of her 21st birthday was valued at $50 million and made her one of the richest women on the planet, practically nothing remained. It is documentarily confirmed that at the time of death, the paltry sum of about $3,500 was in her bank account. This was an absolute, mathematically precise collapse. The capital that her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, had maniacally frugally collected, penny by penny, 5 and 10 cents from the pockets of millions of ordinary American workers, completely dissolved. It was pumped into the bank vaults of 7 ex-husbands, spent on maintaining palaces that she ultimately gave away or lost, and squandered on paying an endless staff of hangers-on. This story cannot fail to provoke the deepest moral reflection on the nature of legacy and the meaning of human existence. The finale of Barbara Hutton's life strikingly echoes the fate of Jay Gatsby, the great literary character of Francis Scott Fitzgerald, who likewise tried to buy love and social recognition with dazzling wealth, and whose path ended in the same absolute loneliness. But Barbara's tragedy was not fictional. It unfolded on the real historical stage. Her life vividly demonstrates how individual ambition, unsupported by genuine human values, inevitably leads to destruction. But how relevant is this story for us today? In the modern era, when social networks daily broadcast the illusion of an ideal, luxurious life, when the number of followers and zeros in a bank account have become the sole measure of success for many, the fate of the poor little rich girl rings out as a piercing warning. She teaches us that no architectural psychology, no Canaletto paintings, and no 18th century French panels can create coziness in a soul corroded by childhood traumas. That marriages contracted as strategic business deals to merge capitals and titles inevitably end in emotional bankruptcy. Paradoxically, the most enduring legacy of the Woolworth family turned out not to be the wealth itself, but that from which Barbara Hutton voluntarily walked away. Her grandfather built his empire for personal aggrandizement. She herself bought up palaces for protection from the world. But the only object that has retained its true meaning and grandeur to this day is the London Winfield House. The house, given to the government for $1, outlived its creators. Today, in these halls, where cries of pain and despair once echoed, the fates of international diplomacy are decided. This final revelation upends our understanding of the entire story. A person's true legacy lies not in what he managed to possess in life, but in what he was able to give to the world. Barbara Hutton tried to cheat the laws of human psychology with a checkbook. She thought she could buy everything: loyalty, status, love, and happiness. But in the end, it turned out that the only indisputable fact of her biography was the emptiness that she could never fill.
Her life is a monumental monument to human fragility, reminding each of us that the greatest wealth is always immaterial, and the most terrible poverty often hides behind the facades of the world's greatest palaces.